okay, let's try this again. I just sat down to film this video and I got like 1 minute in and a helicopter just started circling a little ways away really loudly, and I just deleted everything and I'm starting over now because I completely lost my train of thought and the helicopter was circling for like 5 minutes. It was really annoying. So today I'm going to be doing a review of The Vanished Birds by Simon Jimenez. This is another one from my Hugo Awards reading project. Simon Jimenez is one of the finalists for this year's Astounding Award for Best New Writer, which for some reason that I still don't understand, it's technically not a Hugo, but you vote on it at the same time as the Hugo Awards and it's, awarded at the same time. It's just not officially a Hugo. So anyway, this is a debut novel. And it's a pretty good example of a book that I would never have picked up on my own if it wasn't for this reading project. Before I even get into it, I just want to say, I think this was actually a really excellent book. There were some things about it that weren't really to my taste, and I feel like this review might end up skewing a little bit more towards the negative, but I still think this was well written, and I do kind of feel like the author delivered what he was aiming for in this book, whether or not it happens to be your personal taste. So I don't always feel like I need to give disclaimers when I didn't necessarily love things, but in this case, just because I feel like it was quite a high quality, well-written book, even though it wasn't totally my favorite thing ever, I just wanted to say that. The Vanished Birds is science fiction of a more, I guess I would call it a more literary kind of science fiction. I'm going to talk about the plot and the structure kind of at the same time to give you an idea of what the book is about. It's kind of hard to talk about one without the other. Because the really odd thing about this book is that the entire first chapter is from the point of view of a character who we never see again, and it kind of covers his entire life. It's about a man named Kata who lives on a world that is kind of a pre-industrial level of technology. They're basically just farmers of this one crop, and it sort of turns out that this world is part of a corporation where basically the world just exists to farm this resource, and every 15 years a ship comes from the corporation to collect the crop and take it away. So the people do have this very slight exposure to sort of galactic futuristic technology and people, but mostly they're just kind of living in this relatively primitive society where they are farmers and hunters, and that's kind of all they do. They do seem to have some education and stuff, but it's not a very advanced society. So at the age of 8, which is the first time the crops get collected in his lifetime, Kata meets this woman who's the captain of the starship that comes and collects the crops, and because of the difference in time between the form of travel that the ship goes on and then like what's happening on the planet, he basically sees her every 15 years for the rest of his life, but she has only aged like less than a year. And so that's kind of mostly what this story is about. And this opening chapter was originally published as a short story separately before the rest of the book was written. That really does show. So this kind of thing might bother you. The book is kind of loosely structured where the first chapter is that, and then we don't really ever come back to that character. The second chapter is from the point of view of the starship captain who he meets. The third chapter is from the point of view of this woman who lived first on Earth like 1,000 years earlier, and she is responsible for kind of building the space stations of the future that people now live on. And all these narratives do kind of eventually intertwine, but it's kind of a looser structure. What kind of holds it together is that at the end of the first chapter, and again, this is I guess a little bit of a spoiler, but you would kind of see it in the back cover description of the book. This mysterious boy appears on Kata's planet, kind of just falls out of the sky, basically crash lands, and he doesn't seem to speak, and they don't really know what to do with him. They kind of mistrust him, but Kata entrusts him to Nia, the starship captain, on what's going to be the last time he ever sees her, and so she ends up basically taking him onto the ship and taking responsibility for him, and the rest of the story kind of goes from there. Because there are so many threads of story that kind of get woven together into this narrative, it's a little hard to talk from a plot perspective about what it's really about, but I will say it is a lot about loss and family and what you have and leaving things behind versus holding on to them, and memories. And I just want to say this book made me really depressed. I don't mean to say that casually and dismissively, but like I was finding while I was reading it, I would just start feeling really melancholy and down, and I couldn't figure out why, and then I realized it was like from this book. So I had to take some long breaks from it while I was reading it because it just has this like nostalgic, sad tone where it feels like all the characters just feel kind of like they're all like kind of somewhere else. They're all kind of depressed a little bit, and it just really kind of got to me. And I feel like that was kind of the vibe that the author was going for. And I mean, is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just, I don't know, have you ever found that the tone of a book just super affects you emotionally to the point where it's kind of not great? So that was just my personal experience, and I didn't even consider stopping the book because I was kind of enjoying it. I just took some breaks, and in the end, I am glad that I read this. It's just, it certainly has like a melancholy tone to it. If I had to describe it otherwise, I'd say there's kind of a strong core of a found family story, but it's kind of like more of a dark found family story. Like, I think I even saw a review that sort of called it like a darker, sadder version of the Wayfarers series. I kind of get that, maybe because it doesn't have like the strongest plot direction also, and that's another characteristic of the Wayfarers series, but otherwise I don't really think it's that similar. There aren't all sorts of weird aliens and cultures and things like that I really associate with Becky Chambers, which is sort of exploring like the common personhood of all these really diverse characters. That is not in this book. I'm kind of rambling. But anyway, if you love found family, you might enjoy this. Found family is not particularly a favorite trope of mine. I do like friendship stories, but found family is just, I'm like either neutral to not really liking it as a trope, I guess I would say. When I was thinking about how to review this book, I really started thinking about the difference between science fiction stories that are about the science fiction elements and science fiction stories that sort of use science fictional elements in more literary ways to sort of be a metaphor or express something about what it is to be a person. And this book definitely falls into that last category. You have really typical science fiction tropes, like a form of interstellar travel that it takes a different amount of time for the person on the ship relative to the planet that they're either going to or leaving behind. So it might take like 15 years in real time, but the traveler only experiences 9 months or something like that. That's a pretty common thing that we see a lot in science fiction movies and books. But from a writer's perspective, I feel like there's two different ways you could approach that. You could write a story about how is that going to change society, or how is that going to change people when you have something like that going on, when that's kind of the situation, and sort of write a more exploratory thing about humanity based on sort of how you project things would happen. Or you take something like that and use it as a metaphor for a person that basically abandons people and keeps running from their past. So that's something where you're using the same trope plot element, but you are telling a really, really different kind of story. So for me, I think I enjoy the exploratory stories more, where you're putting people in situations or thinking about things that never have happened or might not ever happen, but you sort of get to the core of like the person or the character or just humanity in general through these new situations that don't happen in the real world. I don't enjoy it quite as much when it's a story that's just kind of feels like it's more of a metaphor or expression of something that's quite common through this like science fiction metaphor. I hope this is making sense. I feel like an example of what I'm talking about is a book like Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro, which I think there was a movie of it in recent memory as well. So a lot of people complained that this wasn't really science fiction. Spoiler, it's about clones. And a lot of people complained that the science fictional elements just made no sense. And I mean, it's true they didn't, but that really wasn't the point. Like, this was not a scenario with clones that ever really would happen. It was just his way of telling a certain story with certain feelings, expressing certain things through using this science fictional element. There's another element in The Vanished Bird's cryogenic sleep, which again is similarly, rather than exploring like what would it do to society, what would the world be like if this was a thing, it's more like just a reflection of this character that's using it and her attitudes and how she has sort of treated her life and the people in her life. So it was well done. It's just kind of the opposite side generally of what really interests me in these kinds of stories. I thought the characters were fairly interesting, especially one who's a little bit more of a like dubious villain character. I don't think she is like the ultimate villain. There isn't really one. This is more of a future story where everything is super corporate and capitalist and terrible, which also isn't like my favorite trope because again, it never really feels like it quite makes sense in terms of how it would work. It just kind of feels like an expression of issues with how things are now with like corporations owning everything. And so yeah, I guess all my sort of issues about this are falling into a similar vein. It's not really a flaw in the book, it just made me think a lot about what kinds of science fiction stories I like to read and why. The writing is really beautiful and I enjoyed reading it. I like sort of slower paced literary stuff. Some of it depending on what kind of stuff you like to read, it might be kind of frustrating to have all these narratives from different characters that are all back to back that you don't really see for a long time how they even connect. And then sometimes one chapter would cover a very short span of time, and then another chapter would cover an entire lifetime or just a really long period of time. And it just felt like it all fits together in this interesting mosaic in the end, but it's definitely not what I would call like really tightly done. And that's obviously intentional. Now, unfortunately, I'm just going to take a moment to be a jerk about something. I probably shouldn't be so picky, but we all have our things, right? So as some of you might know, I'm a professional musician, and in this book, there is one character in particular to whom music is really, really important. And as part of this character's backstory, he was in a situation where there were a bunch of musicians. I don't want to go any more specific than that because I don't actually want to spoil the book. But this is just going to be a classic example of how something can be basically well written, and there weren't like any major problems with the portrayal of music in this, in my opinion. Like, it was sort of neutral, neither really good or really bad. Didn't really speak to me as a musician, but also I wasn't thinking, oh, this person has never heard music before. But at one point, and this is all backstory, it doesn't happen in the action of the book, it talks about the character carrying a bowl of rosin. So rosin is what string players put on their bows to make it basically stick to the string. Basically, the rosin goes on the bow hairs, and that creates the friction that allows the bow hairs to stick to the string. I'm not sure if that's a very good explanation. I'm not a string player. Anyway, rosin. Most of the time, when you see it, it comes like this. Well, this is a little box. Okay, we open up the box badly. I don't know. Okay, we don't actually care. The camera doesn't need to focus on this. Look, it's like a little solid chunk. Could you carry that in a bowl? I guess you could, but like, no, it's not, you don't need to carry around a bowl. And if you were carrying around a bowl, that kind of implies that you'd have powdered rosin, which does exist. Ballet dancers use it on their pointe shoes. And you do use powdered rosin on a bow for a violin or cello or viola if you rehair the bow, which is not something you do regularly. It's like every now and then when it needs it. It's basically a special repair. You don't do it yourself. So if you're going to write a whole book about music, just ask somebody that knows something about instruments to just read the book, and then they'll tell you that rosin doesn't come in bowls. And then when musicians read your book, they won't get sort of triggered by a really stupid, unnecessary small detail that really doesn't matter, and then I won't have to talk about things like this because really nobody but me cares, and I don't even, well, apparently I do care, but yeah. Enjoy the rant, I guess. That was probably the most unnecessary rant I've ever done. I don't think it really reflects badly on the quality of the book. I just, had to express myself. And what is this channel if not just a chance for me to share my feelings? So there, I've done it. And maybe in the future, on a spaceship, for some reason, people are only using powdered rosin for some reason. I don't know. Could be. It's described vaguely enough that I didn't really have any more major complaints. Other than some of those things, I did enjoy this book. I did like it. I don't regret having read it. It gets quite dark at the end, so yeah, not a light read. But if you like more literary science fiction, honestly, you might enjoy this book. I'm not sure if I would read more by the author or not. I think it would probably kind of depend on what kind of story it was or on the premise. But I do think it was really impressive writing, and I'm glad that I read it. So I hope this review was helpful to you. Let me know if you've read this book or if you're planning to, and please like, subscribe if you want to see more videos from me, and I promise not to rant about musician things too much.